Who was Umrao Singh, and how did he get the nickname Running Death? Why did Umrao Singh and other Indians fight for the British Empire as colonial subjects? And how did Umrao Singh's service and the service of his fellow Indians, especially the Sikhs, change the perceptions that the British had about their Indian subjects? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a former U.S. Army soldier and a U.S. Marine, military historian, former professor of history, and a book author. Today we'll be discussing the life and career of Captain Umrao Singh and his service to the British Empire during the Second World War on this episode of Forgotten History. Umrao Singh was born on November 21, 1920 in Haryana province in the region of Punjab in British colonial India to a very poor Sikh family. Umrao, with very few prospects, joined the British Army in 1939. He would later see a life of war, conflict, and eventual independence of his nation, and his actions were a direct result of his dedication to duty, service to his country, but also he became a great representative to his people. Umrao Singh was simply one of 2.5 million Indians who served in the military for the British Empire and Commonwealth countries during the Second World War. His service would see him assigned to the 33rd Artillery Battery of the 30th Artillery Regiment of the Indian Army. Based in Burma, their job was to operate their guns to cover other units trying to secure the roadways and to push the Japanese out of Burma, protecting the border with India. But they suffered many privations. They had low pay, they did not always have adequate food, they suffered with very poor logistics and resupply, they were often very isolated and not reinforced by larger units, which left them exposed to Japanese aggression. In November of 1944, Singh's unit had been sent into the Caledon Valley. They had sporadic contact with the Japanese, who were harassing General Slim's forces trying to secure the roads, what we call the Burma Road, and also to protect from a Japanese invasion of India, which they've been trying to do for 2 years. During this period, December became a sporadic series of firefights. But on December 15th, Singh and his unit, operating a 12-pound artillery piece, found themselves in their first human wave attack. The Japanese attacked with a reinforced company of over 200 men, estimates as high as 400. Singh and his men fired for approximately 5 to 6 hours in this battle, pulling off one of the greatest defenses of a very exposed position in that campaign. The dead were piling up around them. Singh and many of his men were wounded, but they managed to repel that first attack. The next day, the Japanese attacked again. By this time, the firefight lasted for several hours, but then they realized the Japanese were out of ammunition. The bad thing about Umrao Singh and his men was that they were also out of ammunition. They had fired their last canister rounds into the jungle as suppressive fire, and almost all their small arms ammunition had been depleted. All they had were a few belts of machine gun ammunition. Then, later that evening was another attack, and they repelled that. Dawn came, and then the last of the human wave attacks became hand-to-hand combat. By the time the Japanese hit the entrenched position where the gun was located, only Singh and 2 other men were able to fight. The rest were either killed or wounded. At this point in time, out of ammunition, Singh took what amounted to be a large crowbar, which was used to reposition the artillery, and got into hand-to-hand combat. Estimates are that he killed upwards of 20 to 25 the day before they ran out of ammunition. But after that battle was over, when the British and Indian forces managed to reach the plateau where he had been positioned, they found Singh and 2 other men wounded but alive. Singh had been so severely wounded that they could not even tell his ethnicity. such was the head wound and the blood. But around Singh were 10 Japanese soldiers who had been bludgeoned to death by Singh, and the field in front of him was littered with Japanese corpses. The astonished British officer looked at the surrounding terrain and wondered how in the hell anyone could have survived that attack. They heard the fighting, and it took them 2 days to get to the area. Singh was later evacuated and then sent to a hospital where he eventually did recover from his wounds. But they did manage to collect a few surviving wounded Japanese prisoners. And during the post-battle interrogations, it came out that the Japanese had mentioned this one Indian soldier who seemed to be everywhere at any given time, stopping their attack. And one of the Japanese soldiers said they had said, "Beware of going there because of running death," meaning that Singh going up and down the line firing his machine gun until he ran out of ammunition had been so effective. That was the nickname one of the Japanese prisoners of war gave him. The name didn't stick because it was deemed to be a little too gratuitous, but for this segment I want to stick to giving him that nickname that the Japanese gave him, because no greater praise can come from anyone but your enemy. The exploits of Sergeant Umrao Singh in that battle bolstered the morale of the Indian troops who had been bogged down by the Japanese 28th Army. Umrao Singh's two surviving gunmates with him told their story and gave their after-action report. General Slim in his march found the story very enthusiastic with regard to bolstering the morale of the Indian troops, who he felt in some cases were on the verge of mutiny. Also due to the problems that we stated earlier, low pay, little food, tropical disease, malaria being very prevalent, and the constant harassing attacks by the Japanese. Well, Umrao Singh apparently, in defeating that force, had opened a path that actually helped accelerate the advance of British forces deeper into Burma. The Japanese withdrew to consolidate their positions, and they found themselves later subject to artillery attacks and, of course, air attacks. So Umrao Singh bought the entire army time in order to secure those advantageous positions and help consolidate Slim's position and get his forces back on the road. That alone was probably worthy of a high decoration. But upon getting all of these reports and reviewing the information, the evidence, the statements, even from the Japanese prisoners who had survived, it was decided that his commanding officer would put him in for a Victoria Cross. The Victoria Cross is the equivalent of the United States Medal of Honor. Very few were ever awarded, and only 31 Indians received that medal in World War II out of 2.5 million who served. So rare was the decoration and that distinction for gallantry and bravery in battle. Following his unique service to the Empire, on October 15, 1945, Umrao Singh was summoned to Buckingham Palace, where he was greeted by a very grateful King George VI and presented with the Victoria Cross, one of only 31 Indians to be so decorated during World War II. Following that, Singh went back to India, and he went back to farming the small plot of land he inherited from his father. Umrao was later brought to England for the VE Day celebrations and was summoned to London to be honored in a collective group of fellow Victoria Cross recipients and George Cross recipients. And upon arriving, Singh was not allowed to enter because they did not know who he was, and they did not recognize him as being a Victoria Cross recipient, until a car stopped and a senior officer who had recognized Singh, recognized the medal, and said, no, you're going in. And they escorted him in to be honored with some of the other men who had managed to make the trip for this very special celebration. After the service, Umrao Singh went back to India. He had been diagnosed with prostate cancer, and he died on his birthday, November 21st, 2005. And his funeral and his cremation was attended by all of the military hierarchy in India, as well as the British High Council in India and the ambassador to India. Umrao Singh and his fellow soldiers' unique service to their country and to the British Empire began changing the attitudes the British had towards their subjects. There was a lot of racism and animosity towards non-English, non-Caucasian soldiers. The story of Singh and other Indians who received the Victoria Cross began changing that perception. In fact, Mohandas Gandhi, who helped establish Indian independence, would often mention the heroism and bravery of Indian soldiers who helped establish freedom around the world for others, but did not yet have freedom themselves. The service of Singh and his men basically illustrated that the Sikhs in particular, and Indians in general, were a very brave, very proud people, willing to fight for what they believed was right. In the end, Umrao Singh was promoted to captain in his retirement, and the pension was raised to be more adequate with other Caucasian recipients of the Victoria Cross. And that was handled by Prime Minister John Major when Umrao Singh met him and addressed the issue. Umrao Singh wanted to do right for his people, and he wanted to do what was best for his country. And he would give inspirational talks to young people in schools, and he would explain to them how the war affected him, how it affected India, but it proved that India was a country to be reckoned with. And as a result of his and the efforts of others, India is now today the world's largest democracy. So the legend of Umrao Singh stands fast, and his story will always be heralded as one of the greatest individual accomplishments. And he has a special place on the wall of the Royal Artillery in London, where the names of the Victoria Cross recipients are inscribed. Umrao Singh and the other Victoria Cross recipients, as well as the Indians in general who fought for the British and the Allied forces in World War II, proved that heroism is a universal constant. It's found despite race, creed, ethnicity, religion. A man's background means nothing. It's what's in his heart and what's in his mind. And these factors help secure a free India. If you like this episode of Forgotten History, please click like and subscribe. And leave your comments. We'd love to hear from readers and viewers and people who have additional information or just have an opinion. Once again, I'm Colin Heaton for Forgotten History. Thank you for watching.